Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome back to our Biotech Leaders Capital Deployment and Commercialization Strategy, third main content day of the LSX World Congress. Delighted to be joined by, I should say, a panel of companies who are on their own commercialization journey, which is the focus of today's session. Without further ado, really, I'd like to hand over that you want to hear from them. Please do keep the chat and questions coming through as you have been throughout the event on the right-hand side, which we'll get to at the end. Delighted to hand you over to our moderator and an expert who can guide us through this panel, Carl Engleman. So, Carl, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And hello, everybody. Welcome to the panel and welcome to all of those who've joined us today. My name's Carl Engleman. I'm a Vice President at Cello Health Consulting, and I'm going to be the moderator today for our panel, where we're going to talk about the importance of early synchronization of commercial and clinical strategy. I spend a lot of my time working with companies in this space, generally working with startup companies with assets from around phase 1 onwards, starting to think about commercial and clinical strategy and the importance of synchronizing those things. We've got a great panel today with 3 really interesting panelists, each with a very different perspective on the subject and very different background and business profile. So perhaps we can start just by doing a little round of introductions, take a couple of minutes. And if I start, perhaps Denise, with you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Looking forward to a lively panel here. My name's Denise Scots. I am the CEO and a co-founder of Mereo BioPharma. We're a company focused in oncology and rare diseases. We're based in the UK and the US, and we're listed on NASDAQ. My background, I spent some time in R&D management after my training, and then spent over 12 years heading up Nomura Life Science Investment Activity, where we invested in mostly US companies, mostly therapeutic, mostly in phase 2. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Denise. Stephen.
Yes, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Powell. I'm the CEO of eTheRNA Immunotherapies, which is a Belgian-based mRNA company. We are specifically developing cancer therapeutic vaccines and also prophylactic vaccines for infectious disease. Our technologies encompass not just mRNA, but also formulation, and are somewhat unusually for a company which is at early clinical stage, also GMP manufacturing as well. And I'm looking forward to a good panel discussion this afternoon.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And finally, Erik.
Thanks, Carl. So my name is Erik Berg. I look after a company called AM-Pharma. AM-Pharma is in phase 3, a study that we conduct across 3 continents, and we have a target enrollment of up to 1,600 patients to confirm the findings of our phase 2 study. And in that phase 2 study, we noticed that there was a significant reduction of mortality in patients that had acute kidney injury and also other organ injuries on the background of sepsis, which puts us in the critical care setting, which is, of course, a very interesting and dynamic environment currently with the COVID-19 that's ongoing. And I've been with the company for more than a decade. Prior to that, worked in pharma, biotech also in the late 90s, and as consultant. Look very much forward to the discussion today, and definitely indeed the thinking and the level of detail in commercial readiness and preparation and how you integrate that into your clinical study design has evolved over the life of the company.
Great, thank you, Erik. So maybe if I just say a few words and sort of contextualize why are we talking about this topic? We've talked about it, in fact, at LSX previously and at other Congress as well. And I think it's well recognized that there is an increasing trend for companies to either come to market by themselves without a big pharma partner, or to do later deals than perhaps might have been the norm if we went back 10 years or so. And alongside that, there's a trend for increasingly focusing on rare disease or areas of very high unmet need, which results in an increased likelihood of accelerated approval so fast track and accelerated approval. So a shorter time as well from the start of the clinical development through to coming into your launch phase. So I don't want to go into the rationale and the reasons behind those trends, but just to say that's the background context. And what does that really mean if you're a company with an asset post phase one and you're thinking about your next steps? And we strongly believe that there is this increased need now to bring your commercial thinking forward. And to be clear, what we're not saying here is that you need to write your launch plan when you're in phase one. You don't need the full-blown strategy. It's not a big, heavy process. But equally, the high-level understanding or strategy that you have when you do indication prioritization work, for example, isn't going to be enough to give you the level of detail that you're going to need. So you need one more layer of granularity as you move through this process. And probably the first area where that's most easy to think about, and is the topic I'd like to get into first, is when we think about the target product profile, the TPP that you're aiming for, and the evidence generation plan that goes alongside that informs your clinical development and other evidence generation activities. And what's great about the panel is we've got assets in different stages of life cycle, but we've got of development rather, and we've got assets in very different therapy areas as well, which has different implications for that target product profile and the evidence that's required to support it. So perhaps, Erik, we could come to you first, and you could talk to us a little bit about the process that you've gone through at AM-Pharma about developing the target product profile and how that may have changed as you've developed your understanding of the commercial environment over time.
Sure, happy to do that. I guess we all need to have some kind of market forecast for compounds that we're developing, because we all need to attract funding. And of course, the investors would like to know what the approximate size of the market is. But the level of detail over time becomes much more extensive. The granularity that Carl was referring to becomes much more detailed with progression through the clinical development. As a biotech, I guess we, at least in the old times, we had the idea that, well, if we bring it to phase 2, then there will be a pharma company that picks up the drug and will take it to market. And so we don't need to worry too much about commercialization. I think in the current times, when larger sums of money are available for funding of companies, and also with more experience in biotech companies making the transition to become a commercial sustainable company themselves, it becomes, of course, much more important to integrate this thinking earlier on in the development. So at AM-Pharma, in our phase 2 study, we already integrate a couple of elements that are important for the pricing and reimbursement landscape. We do our study on the critical care unit, life-saving drug that we're examining. But besides, of course, a reduction in mortality, quality of life, or the number of procedures that are performed in the hospital, or the length of stay, or the length of ICU stay, are very important cost drivers. So we capture those already in the phase 2 study. But even then, when we developed the phase 3 protocol, we needed to make a further identification of factors that are important to engage with payers and the reimbursement landscape. So we had our phase 3 protocol, at least when we were at synopsis stage, screened by external reimbursement specialists. And also, of course, we consulted with pharmaceutical companies to get input from them on what would be potentially additionally needed than what we're already capturing in our initial design of the phase 3 study. And we did make some tweaks, for example, on the length of follow-up, and also on the amount of data in addition that we would capture, which are not medically very important, but definitely important from a cost driver perspective.
That's great, Erik. And I'm really interested in the idea then that you just said, not medically so important, but really important to this stakeholder. And this, the theme that you often hear when we're working with biotech and biopharma is the importance of research and therefore often being guided by a clinical research perspective, or the importance of patients and being guided by a patient perspective, but then perhaps not always recognizing what's the actual value of all of these things to your asset and your commercial viability when you get to market. So that idea of adding things in that may not have been front of mind if you were solely guided by pure research, but getting a bit more depth of knowledge as well. I think that'll be something that we might come back to. But Stephen, perhaps we can hear from you around in a different way about oncology. specifically and eTheRNA?
So yeah, so of course, immuno-oncology has changed dramatically over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. So starting with a target product profile, one of the very first things we need to consider is not just what is standard of care today, but also what is standard of care tomorrow, and how will we weave in our product into that treatment regimen. And of course, one of the many challenges is that the standard of care and the treatment regimen in oncology may well vary between North America and Europe. And indeed, in our case, where we're considering China as well, the patient population, the prevalence of the disease may well vary quite considerably. So one of our most advanced products is in melanoma. We have a partner in China, but melanoma is not a significant market opportunity. So reconfigure some of our pipeline specifically for the geography that we're thinking about. Equally, with a modality such as mRNA, we have to think about route of administration. How is that route of administration going to be applicable to a particular patient population? And is that likely to apply to a patient population in 5 years plus, if we're in phase 1 now? And I think for us at the target product profile stage, the other thing that we need to think about in the immuno-oncology space generally, think about stratifying patient populations is how we're going to identify the particular patients that we want to reach with our product. So the coexistence of a biomarker and stratification tool alongside our product, even at a very early stage in development, that consideration is important, because that's going to be more important as we move through the gears towards phase 3 and onwards. So I think there are some very key fundamental decisions, and some element of that is forward looking and fortune telling. As you start to try and understand where the trends are going to play out over the course of the next 5 to 10 years in an ever increasingly complex treatment environment. And it's ever increasingly complex because it's becoming ever increasingly successful. So that's a good part of that's why it's complex.
That's great, Stephen. And there's a couple of points that you made there that just really stand out for me and that we would see as kind of really good practice for people. So the first thing that struck me was the clarity on markets. You know, when you talk about China, being really clear on what your priorities are. And it's a cliche, but you know, the old thing of strategy is about choices. And in choosing to do one thing, you're choosing not to do something else. So being really clear, this is where we're going. Therefore, our strategy needs to work for these markets. And it may not work for others, but we have to prioritize. I think the other thing that really stands out is this clarity on the competition. And inherent within that is an understanding of where you're going to be used in the treatment paradigm, and therefore what you need to displace. So that's a common conversation we find having with people is yes, you're going to go into this market. Who do you know, at its most crude, who do you need to beat to take that share? And if you can't answer that question with enough detail to give you the right product profile and the right evidence package, then you're going to struggle to have a commercially differentiated and sustainable product. So I think that real clarity on where are we going to be used, who do we compete against, is something we think is just absolute best practice, even at this earlier stage. Denise, I'm really interested in your perspective on this, because you've got assets in two very different therapy areas with very different challenges when we think about the treatment paradigm and competition.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably best to focus on our rare disease programs for the purpose of this conversation. So we have setrusumab, which is for osteogenesis imperfecta or brittle bone disease, and that's about to enter a phase 2b/3 study. And then we have alvelestat, which is for, we're in a phase 2 study for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. If I start with setrusumab, and actually common to both of these programs, so with our TTP, the approach we take, we call it the 3-petal model. So the physicians, the patients, and the payers. And so very, very early on with setrusumab, we have engaged with all three of these, three of these organizations, if you will. And so, for example, we'll have patients come to the company and talk about the impact of their disease on them, on their family. And, in these conversations, you can actually uncover things that you didn't know about the disease. And of course, we engage with the physicians about the treatment paradigms. For brittle bone disease, there are no existing therapies. So then that drives the conversation on pricing. How do you price this? And so we look for analogs, in other diseases for this. But we have, with setrusumab, we have engaged very, very early on with the payers and the regulators. So we have, at all our regulatory meetings, we have a patient. And that helps us in the discussions on the endpoints, as you can imagine, because sometimes surprising things come up in those conversations. And then through, in particular in Europe, the EMA has some very, very good schemes. A new one that we're in a pilot for, it's called MOCA, that's the initial, where we are sitting down very early with the regulators and the payers. I think we had 8 HTAs at our first health technology assessors at our first meeting. And so we're sitting down and discussing, what are the hard endpoints that they would need to see in order to justify the sort of pricing that we're looking for setrusumab when it comes to market. And so, as we look at these three petals, that inputs then into our TTP and into what we need to do for the pivotal study. Alvelestat is a little bit different. I mean, with brittle bone disease, the primary endpoint is very clear. Alvelestat is somewhat different in that it's harder to find the patients. It takes them 7 years plus to be diagnosed. And also there is an existing therapy on the market, augmentation therapy, that was approved without a very clear clinical benefit on the basis of a biomarker endpoint. And so there, the dynamics are very different, but actually, we using our 3-petal model, again, we're going through this process of inputting into the TTP all these different organizations, and then thinking that through for our what's to come, our phase 3 design.
That's great, Denise. Thank you, and really interesting. Apologies, I'm on mute. My dog has just realised I'm in this office. I really like this idea of the 3 petals, and what it implies to me is this idea of balance between the stakeholders and recognizing the importance of the stakeholders, but also the balance between their perspectives and on the choices that you then make. You also talked about engaging with regulators and payers early, and perhaps that's something the 3 of you could share your experience on, because in broad terms, the kind of clients that I work with will often fall into 2 camps, really generalizing here, but into a camp that will say, we engage as much as possible informally, we try and build relationships, we really want to have that dialogue. And a camp that's much more nervous and says, well, there's periodic milestone formal engagements, and that's when we'll get feedback. So could you guys give your perspectives on that? What's your experience of engaging with regulators and payers, and how open are they to these discussions about either novel endpoints or getting their input into your trial program and selection of endpoints? And maybe Denise, I'll just come back to you as a starting point on that. You can elaborate a little bit more on the work you've been doing.
Yeah, I think, again, we've got two very different programs. So we have sought to engage as early on as possible and, within reason as frequently as possible on our brittle bone program. And that, I think, from all the input we've got, is going to see us in very, very good stead. Now, with this, we do have an analog for pricing in the market that's been approved. It's reimbursed, Crysvita. And so that's helping us. And so we feel comfortable having those, as frequent as possible engagements, especially with the payers. And the endpoint, the primary endpoint is very clear. There's lots of other things we are adding into the study, but the primary endpoint is fracture. It's very clear. Where I think it's harder is with the alpha-1 antitrypsin, where there isn't actually, a formally agreed endpoint for a registrational study. And so I think we're, slightly more cautious there. We're seeing there have been some advisory boards that the FDA has held. So we're doing a little bit more watching and waiting there, I would say. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's very, I think, really the devil is in the detail with these things as to, how you frame them.
Yeah. And Erik, what's that like from your perspective? You talked about critical care, but you also talked about potentially some additional differentiators that would be added in beyond the sort of standard of what might be expected in a critical care setting.
Yeah, and somewhat can relate also to what Denise said. So if there's no really good analogs, it makes it difficult, of course, to have a real discussion without having completed your phase 3 directly with the payers yourself. Still, of course, we have the routine, say, checks that we have done now 3 times to engage with, the payer system, if you like, and the hospital system. To not only take the medical view in, but also the view in from others that are important in the end to get your drug adopted. To make sure that we at least know what potential concerns are or things that they will value, so that you can start to build that into the value story once the data come in. Because as I see it, also that discussion, of course, in setting the right price for a drug is all also a data-driven event. You need to be able to argue, of course, for that price based on the data. Now, in the critical care setting where we're in, with our primary endpoint being 28-day all-cause mortality, you would assume, of course, if you save lives, that the system will not be that cynical, that it will not be paid for. So, and of course, that's also delivers, just like in oncology, it's a very difficult discussion, of course, then what is, a life worth, or what is the quality? And there are some guidances, of course, on that, what you can use for pricing. But yeah, good analogs are for us also not available. There are analogs, but indeed in different diseases that you will need to use, because we're the first one developing a drug in this indication.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Stephen, if we move, keeping on the same theme, but thinking a bit specifically about immuno-oncology, so not just thinking about the pricing, but that differentiation as well. As you said, it's a busy space. There's lots of potential competition now and in the future. What thoughts or conversations are you having with regulators and other stakeholders to think about differentiation as well as achieving the threshold levels that they require?
So we have a lot of engagement with regulators, as indeed everybody on the panel does, but our conversations with regulators tend to be a little bit different, which is to understand the different expectations geographically. And one of the, one of the factors that drives those conversations is, of course, that mRNA is still new. Now, obviously, over the course of the last 12 months, the position with mRNA has changed a little bit. In fact, it's changed a lot. But one of the key factors in mRNA technology is formulation, and formulations, different formulations require different data packages, particularly from a safety aspect. And so the data requirements around the formulations as well as around the drug substance vary quite significantly between the different geographies, specifically Asia and Europe and North America. So we have a very active dialogue going on with the different regulatory agencies, and of course with physicians as well. We have an active dialogue to understand the differences in uptake of new therapies in a particular indication that exists really between Europe and North America. And what we need to do as we move up through the clinical development cycle to be able to show how we fit with those other modalities. Because in particular, where we're dealing with a cancer vaccine, then that is going to be overlaid on top of checkpoint inhibitors and indeed other drug combinations. So we've got to try and figure out how we do that, how we administer it, when we administer it, and what we need to show in terms of combination data.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And it's prompted a couple of interesting questions from the audience. So we're going to pick up some questions as we go along. So there's two that are linked here, one from Andy Whiting and one from Mel Walker. So from Andy, it's what's the earliest stage that you should really be thinking about a detailed target product profile and clinical strategy? Saying that funding agencies like to have an idea even when they're looking at preclinical studies to prove you've thought about it. But do you need to start thinking about it after dose and safety studies, or is that still early, or is it phase 1 or phase 2? When do you need to be thinking about this? And connected to that, and it's probably worth thinking about the two things together, was Mel's question is, some of this stuff sounds like it will be standard now for big pharma companies, and it's relatively well understood. Why do we believe there's a gap for many smaller companies in thinking or acting on these things? So address them either together or separately. But when would you recommend companies start thinking about these things, and what stops smaller companies from doing this? So maybe Stephen, you were speaking, so if you want to give some thoughts on that, and we'll go around the panel.
So we start in preclinical. We can't nominate a preclinical candidate, never mind a clinical candidate, without a target product profile. And one of the issues that we have to build into that is volume, capacity. What sort of drug quantities are we going to require? How many doses would be required per annum, per indication? Because we need to think about some of the manufacturing aspects to our product, as well as some of the clinical data requirements and indeed some of the regulatory requirements. So we are encouraged by our board to introduce that target product profile very early, before we even get to a clinical candidate.
Great, thanks. Erik, your perspective on either the timing or what do you think the barriers might be? Why do companies not do this?
I think we all do it. I would imagine everybody does it also already at the preclinical stage, because you will need to have something to talk to, right? So why you're excited about it? And it's not only the science, you need to be able to see then the clinical utility of it. And if you then know in what setting you use it clinically, then typically already you're starting to build your target product profile. Now, in all fairness, it will be detailed and changed over time, because, for example, a dosing scheme, might not be known in the preclinical stages, unless that is your differentiator to what is there currently out there on the market. So I do feel that we all think about it. It's just a matter of how detailed this at which stage. I think the other part of the question was also whether this is more a large pharma thing versus biotech. Within large pharma, of course, it's more institutionalized, and also the real commercial people are already involved from the beginning onwards. And that's, I think, the part that is different in biotech, because sometimes you don't have commercial people in the organization, just R&D people. And then you might not think about things that are important for when you launch it into the clinic. For example, if you do a 1 hour infusion, or a 6 hour infusion, or a dosing scheme that is once a month, or every week, or twice a week, or whatever, that can be have a huge impact on the commercial perspective for the program. And if you just don't bother about it early on, you might not develop your right preclinical and early clinical stage development plan. So yeah, trying to integrate that then maybe via consultants or reaching out to experts might be very helpful really to build a well-rounded TPP in the right phase.
Yeah, that's great. And picking up on your comment there and Stephen's, I think that idea of bringing in multiple perspectives, either through your board, through outreach to stakeholders. Of course, I'm going to say through consultants, because I'd be in trouble if I didn't. But bringing in those multiple different perspectives as well. I want to come to Denise, but Stephen, do you have a comment to come back to Erik with?
Yeah, I just thought that one of the points that Erik made there is very interesting, because I think the the profile of the operation will often dictate the target product profile, and the timing of its creation, and indeed how it's created. I think if you've got more commercial people and indeed more clinical people in your organization, then perhaps there's a greater tendency to think about some of the comparative elements of where it's relevant of your product and of your drug. Whereas perhaps if it's more of a research demographic within the organization, it may be very much more focused on science and perhaps less on some of those important comparative points. So I think how and when may well be shaped by the makeup of a company. And if there are developers, strong developers in the company, they're almost going to demand it.
Yeah. Great, it's good points. And so, Denise, let's come to you. Tell us a bit about your perspective and experience.
So I mean, we're a little bit unusual in that we acquired our 2 rare disease programs, one from Novartis and one from AstraZeneca, and they already had, in one case, phase 2 data in the indication, although it was, on in a small study. And so, we had to rapidly, obviously, develop the TTPs, but with it, because we were taking these programs over from pharma, we inherited, as you can imagine, huge clinical packages and CMC and tox packages. So, there were pluses and minuses to that. I think that, but I do agree. And having sat on the other side of the table from listening to companies pitch for investment, sometimes with the earlier stage companies, where the focus is really on the innovation and the science, this aspect of thinking about the TTP is missed. And the first time, some of the companies, earlier stage companies, bump into this is actually when they go out to raise a significant amount of capital. And so quite often that first interaction with the investors can, actually create the momentum to sharpen the pencils on this aspect, I think. Because again, the investors, it's another stakeholder, right? So that's on the TTP. I think in terms of the barriers, it's really, it's very cultural. I think it's a very cultural aspect within these smaller companies. And, one thing that we did very, very early on is to bring Hughes Wilson into our organization. Wills was head of patient access and commercial planning at Sobi, and before that at Genzyme. And so we brought her in, initially part-time, to bring this thinking into the organization. And that was a couple of years ago when we were just starting the phase 2 study. And that's had a huge impact on how we think about this and how we've built the clinical programs going forward. So it is about bringing the resources, but in a smaller company, you don't need to add many headcount to develop this way of thinking. You just need 1 or 2 key individuals, and then working with external resources. But that's how we've thought about it.
Yeah, that's great. And I like those 2 comments there. One is, somebody has to be the voice for this. There has to be somebody doing this. If you don't have someone who is accountable or specifically recognized as being the voice for this, then there won't be a voice. But also, when you're small, it can be a person. It doesn't have to be a big build out. I know sometimes if I'm talking to potential clients about this, they say, oh, we don't want to spend a ton of money on commercial yet. And it doesn't need to be a ton of money. It doesn't need to be a lot of thinking, but it needs to be some thinking. And I think that's not a nice sort of jumping off point to the next kind of question, which is, can you talk me through across your organizations, what has your journey been like in terms of thinking about commercial strategy? So moving on from being a kind of a concept of, we've got something interesting, we think we can do it, we're generally heading in this direction, to getting much more towards a clear commercial vision and a plan, or a roadmap at the very least. And again, I'm not saying your launch plan, but a kind of commercial roadmap that says, here's how we're going to get there. And I asked the question, in a slightly leading way, because I know all three of you have made interesting choices along that journey. So perhaps you can, as you give your answer, you could touch on some of the bigger choices that are out there in the public domain that people that illustrate the kind of commercial choices that you guys have made. And Stephen, perhaps to start with you.
So I think I think obviously one of the key decisions is to partner or not to partner, and if to partner, when. Given everything that I said about the complexities of the immuno-oncology space, it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody that partnering is a key part of our process, or a key part of our planning as we go forward, particularly given the requirements of later stage oncology studies. But we got to that point really by indeed just looking at the immuno-oncology landscape, understanding what would be required from a clinical perspective, and then basically backing off that and saying for a product with a sizable patient population, unlike an orphan product, which is still viable in the oncology space, we felt we had to go down the partnering route. As in parallel with that, we were addressing something that I've already referred to a couple of times, which is the manufacturability of our both drug substance and drug product. So mRNA capacity is somewhat limited, but also the capacity for drug product and with lipid-based formulations. So we actually started to think ahead as to how we could manufacture at scale. And one of the decisions we made was to seek a partner, a strategic partner who could manufacture at a larger scale. And that in turn led to a commercial partner for a very specific geography. But it means that we've been able to secure that position. So we know we can make the drug, and we know we have a potential marketing partner for a given territory, leaving other key territories unencumbered. So we can partner those later at a later value inflection point. So there are a number of drivers in that which have led us to that point, which has come from both clinical and also from supply, which have led us to that somewhat mixed commercial model.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think it's a really interesting example, and you and I have spoken separately as well, that sometimes when people think about commercial strategy, there's a temptation, first of all, just to think marketing, and then maybe you drift into thinking about sales footprint and things like that as well. But of course, manufacturing, supply, all that sort of thing, and particularly for things like rare disease, supply and distribution becomes a key part of your commercial footprint. That could be your commercial differentiator in many therapy areas these days. And so when we talk about commercial, it is really in the round. And it's interesting that was the example that you went to straight away. I was pleasantly surprised to be having that conversation. It was very good.
I think we're all now familiar with the challenges of a supply chain where you're having to ship stuff at -80. I mean,
Yes.
it sharpens the mind a little bit, and also feeds back into your development programs. So
Yes.
you start to think about thermostability and some of those aspects which perhaps wouldn't have been addressed previously.
Yeah, and I think Denise will speak to that a little bit with some very concrete examples around availability of things. But let me come to Erik first. We talked about partnering. Erik, AIM, you've had some interesting journey with partnerships and choices that you've made along the way. Talk to us about when did you start thinking about your strategy and how's that evolved?
Yeah, no, we have indeed a very interesting history, because we have had a partner on our main program in the past, Pfizer, when we were conducting our phase 2 study. The benefit of having had that deal in place at the time was that we could start preparing with the pharma partner already for a seamless start of the phase 3 during the phase 2 study. And indeed, for example, investments in manufacturing, being manufacturing a biologic, is important to do. And that needs to be, of course, at scale, at a commercial process, which takes huge investments that typically as a biotech you would like to avoid maybe at that point in time, because you're still waiting for your phase 2 data. In the end, this was an option deal, so Pfizer didn't exercise the option, which meant that we continue to own the asset unencumbered now. So we financed this to do the phase 3 study ourselves. Clearly, of course, it helped having had the partner in place to make the manufacturing robust. But there are basically 4, I think, reasons to partner. One is money and a return for shareholders or an investment into your program. Two is managing timelines, as I just mentioned on Pfizer. It can also be because you lack capabilities or resources, or just geographic reach as a fourth reason. So and the current thinking on partnering within AM-Pharma is that we will build our own commercial infrastructure. And we will start preparing that now, conducting the phase 3 study. But we also have to be nimble that we will not be able to commercialize this drug everywhere in the world ourselves. There are millions of patients with acute kidney injury each year, and we will just be too slow in being able to serve these patients properly around the globe. So our partnering model will definitely be a model where we will look at partnering certain geographic rights to be able to get access to these patients as soon as possible as well.
Great, thank you, Erik. And I'm conscious of time. I want to hear from you, Denise, on this, because I know you've got different strategic approaches across your portfolio as well. So talk to us a little bit about the approach to strategy and then some of the choices that's driven.
Yeah, and we have an immuno-oncology program that we very clearly are going to need to partner to exploit that target fully. So that's very, I think, a very clear decision that we've made. With our rare disease programs, our 2 rare disease programs, our initial strategy that we laid out for the company was that we were going to commercialize these ourselves, whatever that meant, whether it meant not necessarily have our own sales force, but for example, work with other organizations. And we're furthest along with this with setrusumab. And what actually happened, so we were very much, we can raise capital to fund the phase 3 study, and we want to commercialize this ourselves and keep, global rights, basically. However, what happened, and you have to evolve with these things as you take the input. So one of our stakeholders, our investors, basically the thought of a fracture endpoint as the primary endpoint in the study was a little bit scary, because there's all sorts of things that could get that off balance. And so although they all thought it was going to work, they were concerned about a fracture endpoint as the primary endpoint, even though we'd shown in our phase 2 what looked like a 30 to 40% reduction in fracture. So we then sort of evolved our strategy. We said, okay, we still believe we should retain some commercial rights. We want to become a commercial organization. But we then went out to partner on either a co-commercialization or a regional rights basis. And so we've now partnered this program with Ultragenyx. They're a great partner. They developed and launched Crysvita, which is the analog that I spoke about. And what's been interesting for us is we own European rights outright. So this is going to enable us to launch in Europe. But Ultragenyx are responsible for all the costs of global development through to the filing. And so we've got alongside us, an excellent partner for rare diseases. The program is probably going to get far more investment than we could have afforded to do. They're also going to do kids and adults, almost in parallel. And the investment in manufacturing that's needed, which is also quite substantial, it's a biologic, is there. So actually where we find ourselves, from where we started, we feel like now we're in actually a win-win situation with the way the partnership has evolved. However, what I have to say is, I think if we didn't have the original vision of being a commercial company and thinking about global rights from the get-go, I don't think we would have been able to negotiate a deal like this. So we set out our sort of our line in the sand very, very early on. And I think that enabled us to come out with this win-win, partnership deal.
That's great, Denise, thank you. And it strikes me, listening to the three of you today, and also I've spoken to you separately, that the thing that each of you have in common is all three of you and your companies did have that really clear vision. You started out with an idea of where you wanted to get to. Now, whether that vision changed over time almost doesn't matter, but you knew where you wanted to get to. And then you had a clear plan, again, to this level of roadmap, not fine detail, but known broadly, these are the steps we're going to take to get there. And in having that, it allowed you to clearly understand, but also articulate the value of your asset. And in doing that, you've all been able to identify decision points and then make choices. And it seems, certainly to me as an outsider, it seems that for most of those choices, you have been in control of the decision making, which isn't the case for everybody. You know, some people have choice forced upon them. But by having that high level strategy early on and knowing your direction, you've known quite clearly, I think, quite level of detail, the value that you can bring and how you'll realize that. And that gives you a lot more control over the choices that you then have to make. To partner or not to partner is one of them, but there are many others. As we come to sort of the close, we've got a few minutes left, but maybe just around the group, do people just want to comment on that idea of having the vision, having the plan, giving you the control, knowing your own value and the benefit of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Carl. And you know, I think you need to set out your stall from the get-go. And then, but what you do need to do is you need to take the input, you need to listen, and you need to evolve that strategy, you know, as you go through the development. But I think you do need to lay it out very clearly from the beginning.
Thanks.
I agree with that. So it's starting with the end in mind. I guess in project management, you do that as well. And that's also what we do, I guess, you know, developing something to get on the market. So you have to know where you're going, otherwise, yeah, it doesn't matter where you go.
Yes, and having a great idea or great science is a good thing, but having the vision that goes alongside that is equally important to realizing it. Stephen, final thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I think well, coming back to some of Denise's comments and Erik's comments, I think it's finding the balance between having a clear vision and a strategy, but having the agility to adapt to changes, whether it's just a market change or indeed you suddenly have a new opportunity. And I think if you're too dogmatic about things, there's a very high probability you'll miss some opportunity. So one of the advantages of a small biotech company should be its agility. So we all need to keep that. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a quote, and I used it a few times previously, and I'm never, it's a bit like an internet quote. So I'm never entirely sure if it's correct, but it's attributed to Eisenhower, and it is that plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And I think that's the thing, right? The process of going through this thinking is invaluable. Where you end up will almost certainly not be where you plan to end up, and you won't have got there the way that you thought that you would. But the act of doing that thinking is what gives you that ability to be agile, but also be confident in the choices that you're making. You're going to have to make choices on the journey. You want to be able to make confident choices as you go along. And that brings us back to the idea of the importance of bringing this commercial mindset earlier in the development process, which neatly brings us to the end of our time, I think. So maybe if I hand back to Josh, but before I do, thank you to all three of you. It's been really great to hear from you, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Fantastic, thank you, Carl. And yes, a great panel there. I see a few comments already on the chat function here saying some great insights, really important topics. And yeah, thanks for sharing your expertise and insight with us all, Denise, Erik, and Stephen, and to Carl for navigating us through the topic. Please do follow up with any of our panel here, and indeed Carl and the Cello Health team. You've seen the sort of booth area where you can find out a little bit more. And I think Hassan's been kind enough to share some details on any post-event follow-up you might have as well. So we are, I guess, back in just over 10 minutes now, mixing up the formats a little. We're next moving on to a presentation, which is focused on avoiding CMC failures through phase-appropriate clinical development and supply chain setup. So we'll see you back shortly in about 10 minutes. But again, thanks to Carl, to Erik, Denise, and Stephen for today's session. See you again shortly.